welcome to the podcast Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Where was the first Christmas tree in the United States? Well, unraveling this fairly straightforward question, it seems, is not such an easy task, and in fact, actually leads to a bit of a mystery. The Connecticut town of Windsor Locks seems to have as good a claim as anybody, at least as far as the New England section of the country is concerned. But more to the point, looking for proof leads historians down multiple rabbit holes. And in this case, rabbit holes involving a German prisoner of war, the Wizard of Oz, and much more. Well, here to tell us his story is the municipal historian for the town of Windsor Locks, Mickey Danieluk. He'll be along in just a moment with this fascinating tale. This week's trivia question: when we talk about the Holy Land, we're usually talking about the Middle East. When we talk about the Holy Land in Connecticut, where are we talking about? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. So you're a historian. The year is 2025, and you're trying to find out if your hometown was the site of the first Christmas tree in the United States back in the late 1700s. Where do you even begin? Well, if you're in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, some of the work's already been done for you. For instance, there's a stone monument making the declaration that it happened in 1777 on a historic farm that, yes, dates back centuries. The oldest newspaper in the country, the Hartford Courant, published an article all but saying Windsor Locks was likely the first, at least in Connecticut. The man who supposedly decorated that tree was a German prisoner of war from the Revolutionary War, a POW that you happen to know did live on that historic farm. The prisoner was a Hessian. That's a German soldier hired by the British to help them against the colonial forces during the Revolutionary War. And, you happen to know something about German history, which tells us that the first Christmas tree in the world came from Germany, and many other Christmas traditions celebrated in the U.S. today also came from there. So a compelling case to be sure, but not exactly open and shut, particularly because you don't have any hard evidence. No newspaper entry from those years, or even a family diary entry. Well, enter Mickey Danieluk. He's the municipal historian for the town of Windsor Locks. He's studied this issue, and it takes him back in time even to the Wizard of Oz. Well, Mickey's family dates back 3 generations in Windsor Locks, so it's not exactly surprising to find out that he has spent 50 years making sure that this historic property, the Noden Reed Farm and Museum, has not only been maintained, but successfully listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Mickey, this is a great story, and I'm going to call it a story up front because it is a bit of folklore, it's a bit of legend, whether or not it was actually the first Christmas tree, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about that down the road a little bit. What I want to do is talk about why this guy, Hendrik Rodemore, was even in Windsor Locks at the time, and just a little bit of quick history. So if you go back to the Revolutionary War, Battle of Bennington in New York State, really important battle, and the colonial forces win, and they beat the Hessians who were out looking for food and looking for horses, and they underestimated the strength of the colonial forces. Anyway, 700 Hessian prisoners end up getting taken in that battle, and they get first taken to Boston, and from there kind of dispersed around throughout New England. Now, Hendrik somehow ends up in what is today modern-day Windsor Locks. Tell us that part of the story. Where did they take him, and what did he do?
I have a colleague, and his name is Melvin Montemurlo. Melvin Montemurlo is a psychologist, a PhD psychologist, and he got really excited about this story. And so he did an analysis picking the story apart. And yes, Hendrik Rodemore was a Hessian soldier in the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, hired by the British to fight the Americans, and he was captured August 1777. The colonists did not have a prison to keep their prisoners, so they marched them throughout New England. What Melvin found out was about 1781, there was a presentation of Hessian soldiers. I don't want to say up for sale, but they were being assigned or being handed off to people in Connecticut who would want them to work on their farms. So The whole Christmas tree story was dated here as Christmas 1777 because it's the first Christmas after the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, but it's actually perhaps a little later, 1781. Again, the colonists didn't have a prison, so they marched them through New England. Somehow they would parole them or drop them off at different farms. And Samuel Denslow had a 100-acre farm on West Street here in Windsor Locks. West Street's one of our oldest streets, 18th century road. Samuel built a cabin for Hendrick. We know that he was a real person. He was in the mid-19th century histories of Connecticut and Windsor Locks as living here. We know that bees buzz, birds fly, and Germans love the tradition of O Tannenbaum. O Tannenbaum is the honoring of life in the deadness of winter as personified by the greenness of the evergreen when other trees are bare. So it's a celebration of life in a dormant time. Somehow we had some enthusiastic historians, well-meaning, misinformed, perhaps too enthusiastic, who made the claim that, well, he was German, so he had a tree. And not only did he have a tree, but he decorated it. Well, there are no primary sources for him having a tree. He was a stranger in a strange land. And I personally believe that he comforted himself by decorating his cabin in a large way or a small way with evergreen. Windsor Locks was the north section of Windsor. It was known as Pine Meadow, and our terrain is either clay or sandy. That terrain was very nurturing for white pine, and so we had a lot of white pine here. And I don't think it's out of the imagination to imagine that he brought some evergreen into his cabin to comfort himself. A large amount, a small amount, whatever. Can we say he brought a tree in? Well, we could say that, but we don't know that for sure. Decorated it? Well, decorating Christmas trees became a Victorian curiosity in the mid-19th century, about the 1850s.
Now, let me ask you for a second and jump in here. So, you have at the Noden Reed farm, the museum, a gravel walkway that goes down back in toward the woods, and there's a stone there that reads site of the first decorated Christmas tree in New England, and I believe the year 1777 is there. So just square out for me, how do we get, it sounds like this research that says it may have been 1781 or so, sounds like that was maybe a little more recent after that monument was put there?
Yes, and I did not place that monument there. As I said, we had some enthusiastic, well-meaning, uninformed history buffs who just ran with it.
But nevertheless, that's where the cabin was, right?
Yes. So in the old histories that go back to the mid-19th century, we have Hendrick Rodamore mentioned, and we have in rods the location of his cabin from Spring Street and from West Street. And we had a surveyor go out there and mark the site, convert the rods to feet, and mark the site. It's kind of on a knoll overlooking a brook.
So this is actually, I think, very cool. If you could explain the Reed family and what the relationship was to Samuel, who was running the farm at that time.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to go back to ancient Windsor, the 1600s. Pine Meadow, which is now Windsor Locks, was the north section of Windsor. And by 1663, there was one family living here in Pine Meadow. The head of the family was Henry Denslow. There was fear of Indian uprisings. There was a lot of tension between the English settlers and the Native Americans. There was a palisade in Windsor, a fort. And so Henry Denslow went back with his family for safety to the palisade in 1662. Well, he says, I got to go plow my fields. It's April 4th. And they said, Henry, don't leave the stockade. It's not safe out there. And he goes, well, I got to plow my fields. So he goes out to plow his fields, and he's never seen of again. There was a band of warrior Native Americans sweeping through the area en route to the settlement at Simsbury, Connecticut. They were going to Simsbury to burn the settlement They were captured, put on trial, and they admitted killing a man down by the river. Okay, so Henry Denslow has a grandson or a great-grandson named Samuel, and Samuel purchases 100 acres along this colonial road known as West Street. It was the western end of this Pine Meadow area. It's to the Samuel Denslow farm that Henrik Rodamore is assigned. So the Denslows are there, their descendants marry, the farm gets sold off. The Reed family purchases it in 1919, and it's about 80 acres at the time. It was a mainstay during the Depression. A lot of people worked on the farm. It supplied the area with eggs and milk and meat and stuff. By 1973, the last surviving member passes away, Gladys Reed, and it was an understanding amongst the brothers and the sisters that they would leave the remaining 22 acres to the town. So right in the middle of the town of Windsor Locks, we have this oasis, this piece of Americana. We have found in the fields arrowheads. We have found Connecticut copper coins from the 1790s. In the area of where Henrik Rodamore's cabin was, we found them with metal detectors. Perhaps they fell out of his pocket. Each state at the time had its own coinage, and these date from the time that Henrik Rodamore was living there. I just want to add that when Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and published it in 1900 in New York City, he went to find an illustrator, and he went to an artist, and the artist's name was W. W. Denslow, and he was a direct descendant of Henry Denslow, direct descendant of Samuel Denslow, who had this farm, and this is a fact of history. Anyway, all of a sudden, Gladys Reed died, and it became known that her farm would be left to the town. And Noden Reed was Gladys Reed's mother's name. The father's name was Reed, so in her will, she asked that it be called Noden Reed Park.
I want to go through the pluses and minuses of the folklore of whether or not it was the first Christmas tree. Now, at the end of the day, does it really matter? The answer is probably no. But it's a great claim. And frankly, in researching this story before I talked to you, I was trying to see how many other places claim to have the first Christmas tree. And there are a couple, but there aren't many. And I think that's one of the things that actually kind of lends some credence to the claim from Windsor Locks. But let's talk about what the supporters say. And at the end of the day, the supporters say, we really don't know for sure, do we? But, why do they think it's true?
Sure. Mel Montemerlo, in his research, found 15 claims of first Christmas trees in a state or in America. And the first one is 1747 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, followed by another in Philadelphia in 1749. The first was by the Moravian Church there. The second was by the Catholic Church. And these continue 1776 in Trenton, 1777 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 1777 in Windsor Locks, 1781 in Quebec, Canada. I can go down the list.
That would argue for Windsor Locks from that list being the first in not only Connecticut, but New England, right?
Yeah. So when we say the first or the last, I get a little uncomfortable. I would like to say early Christmas tree or one of the first, but to make a claim of first or last, I think is kind of a setup.
Yeah, I don't blame you. Now, the critics on the other side say, first of all, there's no primary source. It's not like Hendrik sat there and brought a Christmas tree in and said, hey, somebody take a picture of me and let's put it in the local paper. We didn't have that back then.
No YouTube. There's no YouTube, right?
Exactly. So now the other point that critics make is that, okay, let's assume this did come over from German culture and that the Hessian soldiers did it. Well, heck, in that one battle, there were 700 Hessian soldiers captured, and what's not to say each of them didn't find some comfort by bringing a Christmas tree in. So that's one of the other things the critics say.
That's correct. But some of them still remained in captivity. Some could have gotten out of incarceration, for lack of a better word. Some of them could have been free working on a farm. We don't know that.
So it's hard to really put a fine point on this. But now I want to point to the Hartford Courant article from Christmas Day, 1955. And Gladys Reed is going to come back into this. Tell me about this guy, Herbert Stokel, who wrote the story about the old timer. What did that article say?
Gladys Reed was the chief accounting secretary for the Hartford Courant. She was very keen into a local history, proud of her farm, and I think she might have talked up the story of, oh, I live on this old farm that goes back to the 1700s. We had a Hessian soldier living there. And I think she told the story to Herbert Stokel. As you know, magazines that come out in a particular season, let's say Christmas time, they like to put a little spicy story in to beef up the holiday mood or whatever. So this Eric Stokel in 1955 came up with this story, Connecticut's First Christmas Tree. And in it, he says that he met an old timer, and the old timer tells the story of Hendrik Rodemore being a Hessian soldier captured at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, and that he put a Christmas tree in his cabin where he lived on Samuel Denslow's farm. And it's kind of a lovely little ditty to spice up the Hartford Courant for Christmas of 1955.
So when you sum it up, and I think you did this very well at the very beginning, nobody knows for sure, but you think it makes a lot of sense, don't you, that he, living there by himself, would have done this?
I believe that he was a stranger in a strange land. I believe he was lonely. He comforted himself, perhaps by bringing in a sprig of green, perhaps an entire tree. This was Pine Meadow. Pine was everywhere, and my belief that he comforted himself with some measure of evergreen for Christmas for the time he was here.
And is it possible, or even sort of logical, that Gladys Reed would have heard this story as part of the oral tradition in Windsor Locks coming down through her family?
Well, Gladys Reed was into local history. She was part of the Windsor Locks Centennial Celebration. She read, I believe, Styles' History of Ancient Windsor, Styles' History of Connecticut, and Rodemore is listed in there. And so putting the bits and pieces together, oh, that's my farm. Oh, that's my backyard. Oh, him being German, perhaps he had a tree here. So it took on a life of its own, kind of snowballed, I would imagine.
So old Hendrik Rodemore, the German prisoner of war, married while he was in Windsor Locks, and he lived in that cabin on Samuel's farm until his wife died. Now here's the thing. As fate would have it, his wife passed away on Christmas Day, 1790. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. You know, Hendrik Rodemore would probably be pretty proud to know that his humble fir tree back in the late 1700s, assuming of course all this is true, has led to 91 million Christmas trees being displayed every year in American homes. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Mickey Danieluk. He's the municipal historian for the town of Windsor Locks. The answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, when we talk about the Holy Land, we're usually referring to the Middle East. When we talk about the Holy Land in Connecticut, where are we talking about? Well, the answer, of course, is Waterbury. The next week on Amazing Tales, if you've ever driven through Waterbury on I-84, particularly at night, you've seen it, the huge white cross on a hill overlooking the city. But have you ever driven up behind the hill and gone to what used to be a novel tourist attraction called Holy Land, USA? It drew tens of thousands of visitors back in the 1900s. Well, next week, we'll take you there. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.